Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are live. Just going to give it another minute for audience to trickle in. We're just waiting for the message from Helios at the end of the film to finish, and then folks will trickle over. All right, everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for being here this afternoon or this evening, depending on your time zone, for our final performance of Stardust. It's so lovely to see you all. My name is Adrienne Boris. I'm the Chief Strategic Officer for Helios Opera. I use she, her pronouns, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our two special guests for today's post-show discussion. The first is Malcolm Hansen. He's the author of the debut novel They Come in All Colors, which was the winner of the 2019 First Novelist Award from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, and it was also nominated for a 2019 NAACP Image Award. They Come in All Colors has been described as, quote, a heartbreaker of a debut, and, quote, a tender and heartfelt examination of what it means to be biracial in America, reminding us that no matter the color of our skin, the possibilities for our future are greatest when we accept who we are. So his novel is out now and available for purchase at your local independent bookstore. I hear it makes a great holiday gift. I've read it and I highly recommend it. Very readable, very smart, a wonderful book. And Sika Dagbovie-Mullins, author of Crossing Black, Mixed Race Identity in Modern American Fiction and Culture, which investigates the ways in which various mixed race writers and public figures have redefined both Blackness and whiteness by invoking multiple racial identities. And she's also the editor of the upcoming graphic novel series Mixed Race Superheroes, which I will definitely be checking out in April 2021 when it comes out, and I hope you will join me. Dr. Dagbovie-Mullins is Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of English at Florida Atlantic University. So we're so glad that they're both here with us today to talk about the piece with our wonderful creative team, who we also have here. So I'd love it if they would also go around and introduce themselves, starting with Felix.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Felix Gerard. I'm a composer and pianist based in Brooklyn. I wrote the music for Stardust and provided the collaborative piano. I live in the Bed-Stuy neighborhood of Brooklyn, and I'm originally from Connecticut. And my pronouns are he, him, his.
BL Foxley.
Hi, I'm BL Foxley. I'm a writer from London. I wrote the text for Stardust, and my pronouns are she and her.
Victoria.
Hi, pleasure to be here. My name is Victoria, originally from Washington, D.C., currently residing in Brooklyn, New York. I was able to participate as the singer and I guess actress for this phenomenal piece. My pronouns are she, her, and hers.
Great. And John.
I'm John De Los Santos, the director of Stardust. My pronouns are he and him, and originally from Texas and now reside in Manhattan.
Thanks, everyone. So I'd actually like to start things off today with a question for our special guests. And so Sika, maybe starting with you, if we could hear a little bit about your work in your own words, why you do it, what do you feel is missing from the discourse around mixed race identity, or what do you hope your work speaks to in that arena? And then after that, Malcolm, same question for you.
Sure. I should say my pronouns are she, her, hers. Before I begin, well, thanks so much for having me. So my work is interested in representations of Black, white, mixed race individuals. My father is from West Africa, and my mother is a white American, and so it's something that has shaped my personal and professional life. And so I'm kind of, my work is most interested in the ways in which really old stereotypes of racial mixedness of Black, white individuals gets recycled in contemporary times, right? So there's this duality of a kind of valorization of mixedness, like, oh, if we all just get together and have babies, we'll end racism. This kind of romanticization and way in which we can talk about mixed race individuals as being the promise and hope of our future. And then on the other lens, there's a kind of demonization of mixed race individuals, right? And that harkens, way back to slavery and before of thinking about, oh, don't have, mixed race people are confused, or even the kind of advice, oh no, you're just going to confuse them, and such. This kind of tragic mulatto archetype that some of us might be familiar with. So I'm interested in, my first book was interested in looking at those representations in literature and some pop culture figures and examining those that were kind of still connected to a Black consciousness. I got my degrees in English and Afro-American studies. And then the second collection that you mentioned, Mixed Race Superheroes, that comes out in April, is actually an anthology of essays about mixed race superheroes and about how these stereotypes get recycled in. Trying to think, Aquaman, if you saw that film, Ant-Man and the Wasp, in which the villain is but also more symbolic or metaphoric representations of mixedness, like the Hulk as being both, right, Bruce Banneker and the monstrous figure. I feel like I'm going on and on. I could probably stop now. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. And I feel like so relevant to this piece and also relevant to so much that we're seeing, exactly right now, both in pop culture and in politics. and Malcolm.
Yeah, so first I want to say thank you for that very kind introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to the conversation. I would say that my kind of overarching concern in my writing, well, at least in the past, was consumed with similar to Sika's, with the question of how mixed race identity was reflected in American fiction. And I was very troubled. It concerned me that even when I read stories that grappled with those questions, they did it in a way that felt very disingenuous and were not satisfying to me. So when the thing that really motivated me to, that made fiction writing interesting to me and exciting to me was the extent to which that I could kind of tackle that question and figure out ways of giving both, giving a representation of what felt true to my experience, and kind of modernizing, if you will, the take on, what it looks like and feels like to be a person of color in this country, but perhaps to pass as white. I was, I've always felt like an outsider in both communities. I've always grappled with this feelings of not belonging. I've grappled with feelings of being disingenuous in my own skin. And, fiction was a way for me to kind of work through that stuff, to create a story where, I wanted other Americans, and I thought that it would be valuable in kind of our national narrative to get what I felt like a more honest representation of that. So that's really what fueled They Come in All Colors. Both, just an updating of these very old themes that we've seen represented in fiction and elsewhere in ways that don't feel entirely genuine or satisfying. Moving forward, I have to say, I'm not sure that concern is going to, the extent to which I feel that it's something that a drum that I have to continue beating. I'm very interested in seeing how other people are dealing with these same questions. And so when I say other people, I think of, both of my sons who now have, they have a Swedish mother and they're very fair skinned, and how they grapple with their identity is going to be considerably different than how I did with mine. And, and to see how, they construct art in a way that kind of helps to produce a narrative that feels updated for themselves, because obviously, the way in which we view these things and the way in which both society and individuals view them and deal with them change over time. So that's all very exciting to me. And I personally like to, have the freedom to explore whatever questions I feel like at the moment seem urgent to me, and to kind of hammer through those. And that may be something that deals with race. It may be something that deals with identity, but it may not. And so I don't like, for me, I don't like the idea of being kind of locked into like there's one overarching question that should define me, and everything that I produce needs to kind of like confront that directly. And if it's not, then I'm somehow kind of failing, kind of negligent in some really critical way. So, I'm really, what fascinates me now is kind of actually writing about white life. And because I've been around a lot of white people, and I feel like I know white people rather well. And I love exploring what that looks like from the point of view of people of color. And I think that's a very exciting space. And so that's something that I would love to have the freedom to explore in my fiction. And that's the direction I'm headed.
That's great. And I think it's something that we talked a lot about on this process, because there are so many different identities coming together to create this piece about identity, relatively quickly, and sort of in this moment in America right now. And what does that mean? And sort of making sure that or at least trying to make sure that no one felt like they were sort of a spokesperson for any particular group, and had to be that in any particular way. And just before I forget, a book that I read recently, if you haven't read, by Kylie Reed, Such a Fun Age, is such a great book around some of those issues about whiteness from a person of color perspective, that that's just me being a book nerd recommending a book to you. So BL Foxley, did you want to speak a little bit to this same question and maybe sort of parlay that into the genesis of this piece and meeting Felix? And, Felix, feel free to jump in on the end of that.
Yeah, I mean, I wrote Stardust, the poems for Stardust were originally separate poems that I wrote as part of my master's degree. And it was based on a lot of my own experience of dealing with racism from different communities, and also on the other side, which in some ways I've perceived as racism, where people are sort of seeing being mixed race as a trend and almost as a fetish. And I think by writing about it, it's acknowledging it and putting a focus on it. But I think for me going forward with writing, I would want to include mixed race stories, but I definitely want to focus on women of color as a whole. And meeting Felix and getting to put music to this piece was a really exciting experience, because I think it brought a whole new light to the original piece.
Yeah, no, BL, I agree. It's important to tell the stories of women of color, and I try to work with as many treble-voiced artists as I can, especially treble-voiced artists of color. That is important to me. And when she first brought this project to me, the first person I thought of was to bring on was Victoria, because we worked together on several things. She premiered my drag opera last year, and we've done tons of concert work and even musical theater together. And she obliged, and I wrote the piece specifically for her voice. The first poem is about the multiracial experience, which I can relate to as a multiracial person. And the double is about self-criticism. And in the last song, I literally wrote it while watching the VP debate with Kamala Harris and being inspired by watching that. And I think, Malcolm, what you said about updating your own narrative for your work to reflect what you believe, that's how I approach art, is like with my compositional idiom, is like it's what I feel represents my narrative. And in this piece, I was able to bring that with the poetry to create three poems not originally meant to be together, give them like a whole kind of structure, which John's direction really elevated.
Yeah, and then speaking of the piece being written specifically for you, Victoria, maybe you could speak a little bit about the experience, first of all, of having that written for you, and secondly, performing the words of, not only a librettist who is a woman of color, but also a living woman of color, and just what was it like sort of being able to bring those words to life?
Those are very loaded questions, but I will do my best to answer them accordingly. It was a beautiful experience because in the classical world, we don't necessarily speak on it too much, but contemporary and modern pieces, specifically operatic pieces, arias, or even art songs, are almost sort of frowned upon in a way if they don't have a status of legacy, or if they're not written by persons like Jake Heggie or a number of other people. So first of all, it was an honor to be a part of this because I appreciate both the artistry of Felix and BL. Secondly, it was an experience with her poetry because I admire the works of women poets and women composers, thinking specifically of people like Undine Moore or, oh my goodness, I am blanking on her name, Dorothy Rudmore. Persons who not only wrote beautiful compositions, but also wrote beautiful poetry. But unfortunately, they're either not here anymore, or they're in another stage of their life where music is not necessarily a part of that. So to not only be able to have these pieces written for my voice, but to perform them and have this beautiful woman of color a phone call or a text message away where I can say, so you wrote a circus attraction for your amusement. What made you think about, like, it wasn't me referring to text of scholars or looking at documentaries on what Mozart or Beethoven or the librettists who wrote for these operas or their art song cycles. It was someone who I felt was tangible, who was relatable, and who I can literally sit down and have an open conversation with over a latte through our 10-hour time difference. As a woman of color, specifically one is identifying as a Black woman, are we really going to go there, Adrian? We're going there? We're going there.
What? Wait, rephrase. What do you mean?
Meaning,
We don't have to.
No. I'm totally okay with it.
All right, let's go. Let's go there then.
This is probably one of the most prolific pieces I've ever performed. As a person who identifies as Black and understanding her past the flowery language of what poetry can sometimes be, it was written plain and simply. It was written to be understood and understandable on both ends. And it was nice to be able to sit with this poetry and really understand and feel where she was coming from. And the music was written beautifully attached to her words, because I felt like they everything that she wanted, everything was nuanced, everything was presented well. But for me, it hit in a different place because we're in a pandemic. Black Lives Matter movement has opened the eyes of so many in multiple ways. And it doesn't just mean people who identify as Anglo-Saxon or otherwise. It has hit people in completely different ways, and made people sit and think. And this piece is what I would say the cherry on top of the ice cream fudge sundae. It's a compilation of everyone's feelings, and specifically people's feelings who identify in a very specific way, being presented in an art form that historically is not seen as progressive or welcoming. But this piece has proven all of those stereotypes completely wrong. So in short of my 5-page essay, it was fabulous.
In conclusion, as we like to say as a former English major, that's great, Victoria. Thank you so much. And you're a poet as well, which is something we haven't really talked about. We did post about it on social media, but I feel like that's, I don't know, that has to be sort of like a special connection as well. And you know, so much of art song, you know, is understanding poetry. And so I think, you know, that must have been even a deeper connection in a way for you as a fellow poet.
Yeah, it was. I am nowhere near what and who BL Foxley is. Nowhere near. I don't think I could ever fully attain any of the greatness of her writing, just because it was done so well, and it was beautiful. But sure, that played a part, like a tiny part.
Yeah, no, I hear you. Great. So we'd love to hear now a little bit from Malcolm and Sika in terms of their reactions to the piece and their questions for the team. So maybe we could start with you, Malcolm.
Sure. You know, so as I mentioned at the outset, you know, I see my art in a really intensely political light, and but that's not the way, you know, when it's kind of tricky, because like the politics informs your emotions, right? But it shouldn't kind of inform the storyline too much, in the sense that people have to be people, right? The stories are about people. But my point is that so much of what people go through is kind of rooted in, it's very kind of historically, you know, it's rooted in the moment, right? The context, the historical moment and of their lives. And so how do, you know, as an artist, when you are creating something, you have this burden of knowing that your work is kind of rooted in a particular moment. I couldn't have written my story without a real, you know, sense of the urgency of Jim Crow and what that meant, what that looked like for certain types of people, and trying to make that real for a reader. I'm really fascinated. Well, I should say, growing up before becoming a writer, it was always, it seemed really curious to me that, you know, this whole business of the Civil War that we learned about in school inadequately, and things that we, when we learned about, the Jim Crow era, what we learned about that inadequately, it was clear to me that, like, well, you know what, like, it's clear that the Civil War, like, that was really never resolved, right? And it was clear that, like, what came out of the civil rights movement at the end of the Jim Crow era was very much an extension of that. However, that never really got resolved. And so I kind of grew up feeling like, wow, America has a lot of unfinished business on its plate, and I guess it's just never going to get taken up. So for me, art was my chosen kind of tool to, like, okay, well, this is what I'll end up writing about. And but I have to say, it's really beautiful, in the past couple of summers with the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, to see, well, I guess this is the moment. Maybe we're getting part 3 of all of this, right? It's really, things are coming to a head in a way that feels, where the urgency and the inevitability of certain questions are being tackled in a way that they haven't to before. And maybe they're being accepted in a way that they haven't been before. So what I'm getting at is I'm very interested in the extent to which this piece is rooted in the historical moment. And I was wondering if any of you could speak to that.
I can say a little something about that, Malcolm, which I think it's a very profound and eloquent interpretation of this piece. Obviously, as you've said, this moment is really influencing all of our work, all of our thoughts, all of our art in so many different ways. And in the history of staging art song and opera, which is what I do, is really, really tricky, because so much of it is based on poetry. And so it is very open to interpretation. And one thing with this particular piece that I was really working towards was illuminating what Felix and BL wrote, while also playing to Victoria's strengths and trying to resolve this disconnect between opera, which is a live performance art, and digital film work, which is how we're working now during COVID. So it's a lot of things, plus all of the layers that are contained in the poetry, the racial and political implications. There's a lot of things that I was trying to deal with. And my goal was really to create something that did have a sense of ambiguity, to where people could interpret this and see themselves reflected in it, whether they are another Black woman or whether they are an older white person, and something in this could connect to them and the interpretation of it. A big influence were the painters Andy Warhol and Francis Bacon, and they were both infamous for never really having an explanation for what their work meant. You take from it what you see inside of this. And so for me personally, I had a lot of thematic ideas that were primarily influenced by the ideas of triptychs and Greek mythology, which I found very omnipresent in BL's work. But I think that Victoria's interpretation, which again is so centered just on her face, on the pain and the triumph that goes on in her emotion, was really a way for any artist or anyone with a hunger for answers in this crazy time, and as you were saying, all these other unresolved issues, could see that reflected in the way that this ended up being presented.
Great, thank you.
And Sika, questions and reactions for the group?
Sure. I've been doing a lot of, my own work has been looking a lot at like comic books, right? And so the relationship between the text and visual. So I was really interested in the relationship or the juxtaposition of what you see and what BL had written, the poems. And so in particular, one of the, I was thinking, I don't have it in front of me, and I'm not sure if the viewers maybe saw the lyrics, but the second stanza of What Am I has a reference to lynching, I believe, right? And that rope, the rope and twine imagery, right? That in that first shot, right? And then it follows throughout all 3 pieces, I believe, or at least the first 2. And so, when I saw that rope before kind of panned out and before we see, Victoria's beautiful face, I thought, oh, wow, that to me is reminiscent of the artistry of Black hair and what we do to our hair. it made me instantly think of braids. And then I thought about all of the various connotations of rope and twine, right? So I thought, oh, like hair, right? And how all of these things are kind of signifiers of identity, or have, or have followed us in terms of, lynching as a form of, socioeconomic control against Black folk, right? So when we think rope, I think, at least for Black people, I can't speak for all Black people, but oftentimes, right, when we see that kind of rope, it recalls, Malcolm was talking about the Jim Crow era and before, right, the lynchers rope. But rope also signifies all these kind of beautiful things, and I think the piece moves from that kind of pain and anguish, right, and trauma, to what John said kind of earlier, where you see all of Victoria's emotions, and there's a kind of, I think you used the word triumph, right? So all of that to ask, I'm really interested in the connection between, maybe we could take rope as a motif in the piece, in both the written piece and in the visual piece. And if you could just maybe, I'd be curious to hear about how it operates as a symbol, how you saw it operating, how maybe BL thought of it.
Yeah, again, that's another incredibly beautiful assessment of this piece that spoke to you in that way. I mean, the initial overarching concept that I came up with was the idea of the Moirai, the Greek fates, who would spin the thread of life and decide how long it was and then cut it. And I said it would be a wonderful idea to take that motif and assign it to each of the three songs, and each of the three songs has a different myth or relates to a different myth. The first song is about the myth of racial equality. The second is the myth about Satan and punishment in a Christian doctrine, even though it's in all other religions also. And then the third is in the myth that we can't do anything about our fate, that all of that is in someone else's hands. And that's why you see that rope that you're talking about is cut. It's cut at the end, which is also like an umbilical cord in some ways. So the idea of I knew that the thread and or the twine, as we called it, was going to be a really important visual metaphor. I had thought about the idea of it coalescing with the lynching rope that you mentioned, but I didn't want to be too literal. I think that the thing with poetry like this is, I think it's much more interesting if it is open to interpretation rather than having a very literal representation of that. So I did want to focus on that, and the shears as well, this swords, daggers, whatever kind of violence you want to attribute to it, and then seeing the reaction of the two different faces. I mean, one of my favorite images is in What Am I, which is, it seems like on the surface a pretty, straightforward song about mixed race identity and racism, but the idea of having these two women in black and white in profile looking towards a pair of black lips in color. What does that say? Do these two women see themselves as other people do? And does the woman in the center who is in color, is she speaking? Is she speaking and saying, I am not these things. I can't be these things. I can't be what everybody else is. I'm just myself. So there were ideas about those kinds of things, but I really wanted to leave a lot of it open, especially with Victoria too, because we had to do this so quickly. And as a singer, I know that she had a lot on her plate to deal with already. So I basically would just say, look, here's how this is going to look. Here's some basic emotional places I would like you to look to, but I want to see you. I want you and your interpretation of this to really be emphasized, because I'm not going to tell Victoria how to interpret poetry that deals with this particular subject. I'm not interested in that. It needs to be from her, and also with BL's experience also. Victoria, do you want to talk any bit about that particular process?
Yeah, like I said before, I really had to sit with this poetry for a while. I literally would walk around my small New York apartment and just review the poetry. I loved John's interpretation of the thread, the tool, and the three fates. How I interpreted it midway through and later came to a conclusion was taking control of one's life, and how I'm seeing that now within myself and within other young millennial Americans, or just older, or everyone is taking control of their life, whether that means taking accountability, whether that means being the person that's going to stand up and actually speak on something that maybe has hardened or softened their heart, whether that is something of a realization or an epiphany, which I think is also displayed in Mother Nature towards the end with this supernova explosion. And I love the fact that John did that at the end and then went to the image of her being completely bare or naked. And that is also something that can be left to interpretation. But for me, I just saw it as taking control of my life. I think the first image of playing with the thread, and we shot that image quite a few times, of what it means to control or pull on it or tug on it, and how you feel about that. And he gave me this idea that this tool was someone's life. For me, I just took it as it being my own life, and either thinking of myself as another entity holding and controlling my life, which a lot of people believe in either God or universe or whatever that belief may be. And then some people think of that as maybe a mirror image of themselves taking control or not taking control of their life, and being pulled and shoved and twisted and molded into whatever this can be. And I love by the end, because the tool starts as this confusing piece of material. It's not, there's no formula to it. There's no, this way is the way that you get out of this entanglement, and then you go this way, and then you do this. There's no instruction. There's no simple lineup. There's nothing. But by the end, in Mother Nature, and even in the Devil, you see that there are these several pieces of this one thread that's being controlled. Again, interpretation can either be yourself or these other entities. And for me, I took it as myself, because the devil is me. The devil, some ways, how we choose to see our life. We can either say that whatever is going wrong in our lives is somebody else's fault, or something else is doing, or you can take that accountability for yourself and recognize, no, I have some trauma, some issues of my life, some issues politically, morally, spiritually, physically, mentally, whatever. And this is something I have to get a hold of. And then by the end of Mother Nature, you cut that thread and you've come to the conclusion, okay, I need to take control, and I'm going to start from here, whether that means you're starting from the ground up, whether you have a foundation or not. So that's how I chose to think of it. And Malcolm, I think you put it perfectly. Emotions are sort of political. I don't think we realize that as a human race, because if you think about your politics are informed by how you view things morally, how you think, how you move throughout your day, how you interact with people. And I think that this piece is extremely political in that way, because it is very emotional in multiple ways and in multiple layers. But it's up to you and your politics and how you work through that, and what entities or methods you choose to use to move forward to those next steps, whether that's taking accountability or not. I hope that I did not go into a huge spiel.
No, thank you. That's great. And BL Foxley, just, in response to Sika's question, or anything sort of about the personal versus political, I know the rope is more of John's imagery, but just it would be interesting to hear sort of what that brought up for you about your own writing or anything like that, or even, if you have any questions for our special guests as well. I know as a fellow writer, you might, so please go ahead.
Yeah, seeing it as a visual piece was, in terms of the rope, I thought it was really strategic, using the rope, given the line in the poem. When I wrote that line, that was to compare how, as a mixed race person, it's often that one side of your race might be accepted and another one isn't, which can be from pretty much any race. It won't necessarily be from like within a family, within a friend group, and it can be in a lot of different situations. So I describe it as a wretched dynasty because I think the dynasty of racism that has been going for centuries is what that judgment is built on. So in the later line, when she says, perhaps I'm your guiding light. So that's earlier on. It's this moment where she realizes, I don't need to be one. I don't need to pick one race over the other. I'm the best of both worlds, which I really loved in the visual piece when she is her own miracle. She saves herself and Earth. So in terms of questions for other writers, I was really interested to see how to see if you saw any references to superheroes within Mother Nature.
Wow.
Oh, and we should say also that B.L. Foxley writes a lot of fantasy and science fiction. You know, that's sort of her other than poetry, her sort of primary genre. So I think that's part of what John was seeing in the piece in terms of this epicness as well.
Yeah, I did not initially, but now I feel compelled to look at it with a new lens and think about that. I mean, certainly, you know, knowing that you have interest in fantasy, I did think about the otherworldly, which is obviously not the same thing, but is connected, right? And so the kind of power of, I remember first description of leafy hair, right? And of kind of the power of Mother Nature, the fire in her eyes, and those other, right, as, you know, emblematizing something more than, it's something superhuman, which is not superhero, but it's certainly Mother Nature is superhuman, absolutely. In terms of the power control. And I think that, as I recall in Victoria's portrayal of that, you can see that in her posturing and her poise and how she, right, particularly at the very end, how she works her way towards kind of embodying that power. In terms of specifically superheroes, I think I'd have to like rewatch and reread and think about that. But certainly I thought of the superhuman, right? Yeah, powers that go beyond the realm of this realm.
Yeah, I sort of see there's this evolution, you know, to me it feels like from the very small to the very, as you say, almost superhuman and evolved in a sense. So great. So it doesn't look like there are any audience questions. Of course, now that I'm saying this, some may pop up. But since we're just about at our time, I'll take this opportunity to wrap things up. And thank you so much, Malcolm and Sika, for being with us and for your wonderful, insightful reactions to the work and questions about it. Thank you, as always, to our beautiful and generous creative team. I'm sad that this is the last time that we'll be gathering to discuss the rich piece that you've created with us. So I usually take this moment to plug the show, but this is our last screening. You know, if you're new to Helios, certainly welcome. Please follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You'll get an email, a thank you email for coming that explains a way that you can kind of get involved a little bit by posting a short review and a couple selfies of yourself, and we will Stardust you and repost that. So thank you so much. 10% of all of the ticket sales from this whole weekend, so today and Friday night as well, will be donated to Trinity Place Shelter in New York for LGBTQ plus youth. So thank you for being a part of that. And it's been amazing speaking with you all. Please stay safe, take care of yourselves, and have happy holidays and a happy new year.
Same to you.
Bye.
Thank you.